There it is. There's fish. Finally. Nice one too. All right. Decent largie of the day. First one. Not bad. This is the fish that's reshaping the kayak fishing industry. I'm not sure if it's for the better though, but not a bad way to start today. Get this one back in the water. There it goes. Put that one on a spinner bait. So I've been kayak fishing for the greater part of a decade now, and actually got my start in kayak fishing in a little sit inside Wilderness Systems Pamlico when I was fishing for primarily catfish in the panhandle of Florida, although I grew up bass fishing in Kansas. But I really started to notice in the past few years a really significant shift in the industry, and that is that was a good bite. I missed it. And that is, I'm going to back up so I don't go over the top of that spot. See if I can get it again. There's been a really big shift in the design of kayaks, and the diversity of kayaks available has actually declined. And there's one big reason for that, and that is this overwhelming influence of the bass fisheries on the kayak fishing industry. If you were to look at all the fishing kayaks on the market today, the majority of them are under 13 foot in length, somewhere in that 34 to 35 inches wide, and most of them are pushing 100 pounds now. And that is not how the industry began. It actually began here on the West Coast. The original sit-on-top fishing kayak was born in California out of California's longboard culture, where Tim Niemeyer designed the first self-draining sit-on-top kayak. And it was primarily used by West Coast, nearshore anglers, and a lot of spear fishermen too were using it. To go out and get rockfish and lingcod, sheep's head, things like that. And that original one was made out of fiberglass, so it was still probably pretty heavy. But in the 1980s, he really revolutionized the industry by making the first rotomolded plastic kayak, and it was based on his earlier designs, and it was called the Scupper Pro. And so it was a self-draining kayak. It was over 14 feet long and self-draining, pretty minimal in terms of features. Like, it didn't have all that stuff that we expect today, like gear tracks and rod holders and all that stuff. That all came later, but it's still regarded as one of the fastest paddle fishing, sit-on-top fishing kayaks ever made. There's actually still quite a number of them floating around in pretty good condition on the used market. So Ocean Kayak was the birth of that, and then from that we saw a whole bunch of proliferation of other companies developing their own sit-on-top kayaks. And a lot of those kayaks were all fairly similar because they're all designed to be paddled. So you had to have a kayak that was reasonably light and reasonably fast, because a big, fat, heavy kayak is just not easy to paddle, and it wouldn't have competed on the open market well. But then came along Hobie, and they introduced the first pedal-driven kayaks. And with the invention of their Mirage Drive system, which revolutionized everything, that marked a major turning point in the kayak fishing industry, because suddenly engineers weren't so worried about making kayaks easy to pedal. And then Native, about a decade later, came out with their prop system, their pedal prop system, which was a bicycle style pedal system like the PDL I'm using today. And lots of other companies came out with their own versions of that, and basically nearly every major kayak fishing manufacturer in the United States now has either their own unique pedal prop system, or they've adopted the original Hobie Mirage drive since the patent on it expired. So there was this really interesting time when there was still a fair number of paddle kayaks on the market and a whole diversification of pedal drive kayaks, as everybody was sort of trying to find their niche, find the market. Kayak fishing wasn't a big industry, in the late 90s through 2010. It wasn't that big of a... Oh man, how did I miss that fish? That was a good hit. See if I can get it again. And yeah, so there was pretty much a kayak for everybody. If you wanted a fast, skinny kayak that you could paddle or pedal, there was one on the market. If you wanted a fat, slow, heavy one that you could use in the backwaters for bass or whatever you needed, there was a kayak for you. But then something happened. There was a fundamental shift in the industry as the kayak bass tournament series really started to get going, and that sport really started to grow, especially in the Southeast United States. There was a lot of opportunity there for these companies to capitalize on sales, and these were people who were into competition. They were willing to dump a lot of money into a kayak. They had tons of gear, and so suddenly there was this huge demand for kayaks that were bigger, had higher weight capacities, because these competitive anglers they have so much gear on their boats. They're on their kayaks. They're taking out a huge amount of tackle, large numbers of rods. They wanted to be able to stand and sight cast and pitch for bass and structure and cover, and those types of boats really worked very well in other fisheries in the southeastern United States, such as the flats fisheries, where people are going out and chasing tarpon and snook and such, and redfish on the flats. So big, stable kayaks that you could stand in were at a high demand, and the weather in the southeastern United States is better for year-round kayaking than a large part of the rest of the United States. And so that was the lucrative market, and everybody started chasing it like crazy. And it became sort of an obsession with a lot of these kayak companies. And so the southeastern United States, with its bass fisheries and growing tournament circuits and flats fishing, became the dominant market, and these kayak companies started really catering more and more to kayak anglers in that region. And I think this was really well illustrated with, Hobie, who was originally a West Coast kayak fishing company. They signed this contract deal or whatever. Ooh, there's fish right there. They signed that kayak deal with Mike Iaconelli to develop a branded kayak. Man, he's engulfed that thing with his name on it. Not a very big one, but he was hungry. It's probably the little ones I've been feeling bop my spinner as I've been going along there. So as I was saying, Hobie signed on Mike Iaconelli as this really bombastic powerboat angler from the professional powerboat tournament series, which seemed really odd to me, to be trying to draw people into the sport of kayak bass fishing by using a branded kayak from a powerboat kayak angler, one that doesn't necessarily have the best reputation for being a good sportsman, especially. But I think it illustrated really well just the industry's focus on that region. And then along came the pandemic, and interest in kayak fishing absolutely exploded. And it takes a long time to manufacture a rotomolded kayaks. They have these big molds. They pump all the plastic beads in there, and they rotate these things in an oven, and they have to take a long time to cool. Those molds are not cheap, and there was just a limited amount of capacity for these companies to manufacture kayaks. And with this pandemic, everybody wanted a kayak, and so they were over a year backlogged. A lot of the companies were on getting orders out, and people were scrambling to get their hands on a kayak because we were all trapped at home. Had nothing else to do. We had lots of spare time. We had spare money. And there were stimulus checks coming in, and those manufacturers made a tactical decision to essentially free up oven space by eliminating the less popular kayaks in their lineup. And for a lot of manufacturers, that was their slim, lightweight, fast kayaks, which are not in demand in the Southeast United States, but are the primary kayaks that a lot of anglers are demanding here for our West Coast fisheries, where we're out big rivers, high current. Our near shore fishing in the Pacific requires a kayak that has a lot of speed and the ability to cut through waves. And these big, slow, heavy, clunky kayaks that are great for bass fisheries, they are not good for our Northwest fisheries. They're just not suitable. Sure, you can definitely make them work, but I would say that a kayak like the Pro Angler from Hobie, or the Autopilot from Old Town, or its Sportsman's PDL 120 and 106, those are fine for slackwater fisheries on the Columbia, but I wouldn't want to be punching the surf in those things. I wouldn't want to be out in the Pacific on any kind of day where there's a decent amount of wind waves and swell. And I think this was particularly well illustrated early in the pandemic. We saw Hobie eliminate its Hobie Revo, the Revolution 16-foot Mirage Drive kayak, which was definitely the fastest pedal-driven kayak fishing kayak on the market. I mean, that thing was incredibly fast and very popular among kayak anglers here in the Northwest that did Puget Sound and Columbia River and offshore stuff. Likewise, Native eliminated all of its 14-foot plus paddle kayaks, just instead focusing on their more popular Titan series pedal-driven, primarily bass fishing kayaks. And then this year in 2022, these companies are still catching up with demand. I mean, once that fire got started, there was no putting it out. I mean, the demand still remains incredibly high. And in 2022, Johnson Outdoors, which had at one point acquired Ocean Kayak, the original kayak fishing company, they eliminated all of their fishing kayaks. So the Trident and Prowler, which had a lot of the features of the original Scupper Pro, they eliminated those entirely. They essentially have almost no fishing kayaks left in their lineup. That essentially brought about the end of the sort of last West Coast designed fishing kayaks that were built for paddling, built for speed, that were lightweight. And it was really an end of an era, and it really concerns me because here I am trying to represent these brands and promote this sport of kayak fishing here in the Northwest, and I feel like these kayak companies have completely lost sight of this market up here. They're just so obsessed with the bass side of it, And it's not that I don't have any animosity towards kayak bass fishermen. I mean, I'm out here doing it today, and I love bass fishing from my kayak, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend that, you know, all these kayaks that were designed and built with kayak fishermen in mind, especially, you know, in stagnant waters in the southeastern United States, where, you know, where they might get a 2-foot wind chop on a bad day, they just don't meet the requirements of our Pacific Northwest fisheries, our West Coast fisheries, all that well. Most are not suitable for surf punching. Most are way heavier than they need to be. We're just not as gear intensive as a lot of these southeastern bass fisheries. Like, we're not putting dual 7 or 9-inch screens on there and running a live scope and, you know, all these crazy things and power poles. A power pole would be absolutely useless in the Pacific Northwest. I could use it for exactly like 3 weeks of the year, and then the rest of the year I would never need it. I mean, the depths that we're fishing in are oftentimes well over 100 feet. You can't use a power pole in 100 foot of water. And let's face it, most of our fisheries here are jigging and troll fisheries, so we just don't have the same demands in our fisheries as those southeastern bass fisheries. And I think this is only just amplifying. I look at 2022, you know, and I follow all of the social media outlets of all these major companies, and it's just bass. They've all got their own tournament series now. Hobie BOS tournament series, Old Town sponsoring BASS, Native's got its own series now, and that's on top of all these other series, like these regional KBF series that are, each state may have one or more divisions. And so there's just this amplification of of kayak bass fishing. And so many of these companies, I look at their social media pages, they're becoming so one-dimensional. It's just bass. Then they'll throw in something else. And I think they're doing a disservice and really turning off a lot of potential customers in other parts of the United States that don't do bass. I mean, here in the Northwest, we certainly have some spectacular bass fishing. In fact, we arguably have some of the best smallmouth bass fishing in the United States. But, you know, the bulk of kayak fishermen here are chasing trout, kokanee, salmon, sturgeon, and nearshore species like rockfish and lingcod. And representation of those fisheries in the industry is severely lacking. Like, it seems like they have almost no interest in promoting those fisheries whatsoever and tapping into this market. We have very few kayak shops, and we always seem to be on the very end of the supply chain when it comes to getting orders in up here. So it's a little bit frustrating. I mean, it's definitely a little bit frustrating for me. You'll see I'm out here in my salty 120 PDL, bass fishing out of it, because there's a lot to like about this kayak. It's fairly light. It's still heavier than I like it to be, but it's, you know, 80-ish pounds. It's fast. It's windy today, and which is normal for us. We're always windy here in the Northwest, especially in the spring. And yeah, I can turn that bow into it and it'll cut through these waves and wind waves no problem. It doesn't, I'm not that high up off the water, so I'm not like acting like a sail, which is a problem I have with a lot of the other, you know, kayaks out there, where the aim is like to push people higher and higher up off the water, and in order to make their kayak stable, they have to go wider and wider and wider. And you know, I really want a kayak that's sit on top, that's 13, 14 feet long, that's fast, that can cover ground, that can combat current, and can cut through waves. I don't need it to have a 500-pound capacity. I realize that reducing the capacity is going to, make some kayaks unsuitable for larger anglers. But I mean, you can't keep catering to larger anglers, because when you do that, you're creating kayaks that aren't necessarily that great for just your average sized guy, 5'7", 175, Yeah, I'd like to be a little lighter, but I got my COVID-15. But yeah, I don't need this ultra wide, ultra stable, and I don't want an ultra heavy kayak. I want a fast, slim kayak that has some storage capacity built into it. I mean, that's one of the things I don't like about the Salty, is that they really skimped on the storage, and through some customization I've been able to create some pockets and storage space for myself. But yeah, it's not, I don't feel like this kayak could be great, right? Like if they had just put a little bit more effort into customizing it for fishermen. But basically they just adopted Ocean Kayak's Malibu PDL and rebranded it as a fishing kayak. And it's a good fishing kayak. It's one of my favorites, but is it perfect? Not by any means. But there's no other kayak out there in this price range. It's right around $2,000. That's really gonna fit my needs in terms of speed, agility, and weight. So getting back to the original title of the video, which is "Are Bass Ruining Kayak Fishing?" I think in a way they are, in their disproportionate impact on kayak design and kayak selection within the industry. And that's just the industry responding to market demands, right? I certainly don't think that, this focus on bass fishing is done out of any sort of malevolence towards other regions or other fisheries. It's just free market capitalism. That's how it works. But I'm not going to sit here and say that free market capitalism necessarily benefits everybody equally at the same time. If you're a kayak bass fisherman or somebody who fishes the flats and wants a big, stable fishing kayak that you don't have to worry about hauling up and down steep boat ramps in a mountainous region, then you essentially have hundreds of kayaks to pick from. There's just so many different models out there now that will fit your needs, and you can really find a kayak that will cater precisely to the layout that you want, and to the propulsion system that you want, and to the weight that you want, and the weight capacity that you want. Whereas here, if you're in the Northwest and you want something that's really good for trolling and punching through the surf, has pedal drives, but you need it light enough to haul up and down steep boat ramps and mountainous lakes as well, or go across really soft sand or gravel and deal with big tidal exchanges and things like that, your options are really limited. So we're stuck with trying to shove these kayaks, which aren't necessarily designed with our fisheries in mind. We're shoving these square pegs through round holes. I mean, the Salty is a great kayak because it was designed with West Coast fisheries in mind, and that's why I fish out of it. But it's still shorter than I want it to be. It gets really challenging finding a kayak that's going to fit my needs, because I don't want a big heavy kayak, because you can see behind me there's mountains everywhere. These reservoirs get drawn up and down. The boat ramps are extremely steep and busy in the summertime, and I have to be able to cart my kayak up and down these long steep boat ramps, and I don't want to cart 125-pound kayak. I want a 65-pound kayak. I want a 70-pound kayak. Do I need that to be able to stand in that kayak? No. 99% of the time, I'm trolling or jigging, I don't need to stand to fish. I don't need to stand to fight the fish. There's no advantage to being able to stand. I don't need that kind of primary stability. I would much rather sacrifice that for greater speed, for 20 pounds less plastic, for something with a little bit more aggressive bow to be able to handle cutting through the waves. I want something like that. And do I have a lot of options for that? I don't. They're fairly limited. The options I did have all been eliminated, right? And this is really, for me, as somebody who wants to promote the sport in the region, this is a huge concern to me, because a lot of the well-designed paddle craft, which is the entry level, right? Not everybody's going to have $2, $3, $4 grand to dump on their first purchase. They're going to move into it just like I did. They're going to come into it in a more affordable paddle kayak, and those well-designed paddle kayaks for our West Coast fisheries most are gone. They're canceled, they're discontinued, and they don't exist anymore. And so people are having to make this huge initial investment into these kayaks in order to get into the sport. Yeah, so there's this huge issue for me, because the quality, well-designed kayaks for our demanding fisheries in the Northwest, the good ones are gone. They all got discontinued because those brands doubled down on the bass fisheries in the Southeast United States. And so all we're left with is the sort of cheap brands, like the budget brands, that are overseas, manufactured overseas, not the highest quality, a lot of thermomolded stuff, not rotomolded. And that's terrible to put in, somebody who's looking to get into the sport, to put them into those type of kayaks, because they're probably not going to have as enjoyable experience, with the sport using a subpar fishing kayak, that's not designed well, that's not manufactured well. Whereas they would have had a much better experience at a similar price point in some of these other brands and models that were discontinued. So, yeah, I do have really grave concerns about the direction the sport is going, especially from a West Coast perspective. And unfortunately, looking at trends, I just don't see this pattern changing anytime soon. I think, there's going to be this strong emphasis on designing kayaks for and catering towards that southeastern or eastern U.S. bass fisheries just more and more, and with good reason. There's tons of money to be made in doing it, but I do think it's a missed opportunity for growing the sport in the western United States and in other areas where bass are not the dominant fishery. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. I know that a lot of my followers aren't particularly fond of bass fishing, and I don't want the comment section to turn into this big bass bashing festival, because I actually really love bass fishing from my kayak. It's what I grew up doing. It's how I got into the sport. I spent many days on the little aluminum boat with my dad catching bass, and I look back on those memories with a lot of fondness. I just want people to be happy and get out kayak fishing. Honestly, just want to see the sport of kayak fishing grow. I think it's really fun. It's a great way to connect with the water, to connect with nature. Part of having a positive experience on the water is having a kayak that's well designed and suited to the fishery that you're in. And if you don't have that, you're going to have less of a pleasant experience on the water. And those trends that I've talked about, that's my concern, right? Is that there's less choice for anglers like myself today than there was just a few years ago, because of this huge influence of the kayak bass fishing industry on kayak manufacturing. Anyways, that's enough of me on my soapbox. I'm gonna try and stick a few fish in the face here and just enjoy some quiet time without the camera on me on the water. I'll see you guys next time, and I would love to hear your thoughts below, so let me know in the comment section. Fish smarter, not harder. Bye guys.